I'm Charlotte Phillips. I'm the chairperson of Brooklyn for Peace, and I wanted to welcome you to this space, the Brooklyn Commons, and thank you very much for coming out tonight, especially in the bad weather. Just one point, the restrooms, if you need them, are around the corner, around that corner to the right, or up the ramp and to your left, directly across from the elevator. In case you're not familiar with Brooklyn for Peace, and I see many new faces here tonight, which is great, we are a multi-issue, non-partisan, non-sectarian organization. We've been working in Brooklyn since 1984. We're primarily an educational organization, but we see an active response as a vital component of education.
I'm actually at an event.
Our core mission is the prevention of war and the social and economic injustices that lead to war. If you're not already on our mailing list, please sign in legibly so that we can stay in touch with you, and also consider becoming a member, as we have a lot of work to do in the difficult times ahead. I also want to mention, just in case you haven't met her, this is Lily. Our new program coordinator, so we're very happy to welcome her tonight. So this forum is entitled, Which Way in Korea? Threats and War, or Olympic Truce and Diplomacy. I'd like to thank Fort Greene Peace, Peace Action New York State, and the Historians for Peace and Democracy for their co-sponsorship and for helping us to get the word out about this event. We're very glad to have with us two speakers to help us tackle the question of whether war on the Korean Peninsula is an imminent possibility in view of President Trump's threats and militaristic posture. In particular, we hope that with a deeper understanding, we will be better equipped to take action to prevent what could be a catastrophic war. Juyeon J.C. is a Korean-born grassroots organizer with Nodutdol for Korean Community Development. She's a graduate of Brooklyn Law School and a board member of both Nodutdol and the Korea Policy Institute. And she will present a brief history specifically for peace activists leading up to the current crisis. William Hartung, or Bill as we know him, is director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. And he will delve into the background of U.S. nuclear policy as it relates to North Korea. Each speaker will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, following which we'll have a few announcements and then time for questions and answers. Juyeon will speak first.
Hi everyone, my name is Juyeon. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I believe that we have been hearing about the North Korea nuclear crisis for a while. And oftentimes we are asked to speak about Korean history. And I think this mic is easy to loud.
It's good.
No? Yeah, it's good. I see the echo. And it's really hard to make it like to talk about the entire Korean history. So I thought that I just pick a little bit of an earlier Korean history that you may not have heard. I'm positively sure you have heard as a related peace activist about recent U.S. interventions and aggressions in East Asia or Asia Pacific. And a lot of people think that the beginning of this conflict lies in a Korean War, or US's attempt to block Russia or Soviet Union at the time, as it was known, or China currently. I think it is largely true, but the war, Korean War, many people know it's the conflict between North Korea and South Korea. And US as a benefactor or a friend went in to protect South Korea is what they think, they like to think. Is that really true is the question that I and many Korean American activists or Korean progressive movement people are having. US has always worked on pursuing its own interest, mostly as a state or a spokesperson of a capitalist or large corporations or military industrial complex, that U.S. is only seeking its interest. if we always keep that in mind when it's dealing with the foreign policies, then I think it is a little bit much clearer. Anyway, the war is between North Korea and US. And a lot of times we have to see why is North Korea always making threats against the US, not against South Korea. And they are trying to build a peace treaty or peace negotiations with the US. Is that because US is the most powerful country? Or is it because US was a party to the South Korean War? Or is it because the US is the only country that has made a direct threat to the very existence of North Korea? So I thought this, truth is a really interesting word, because as you saw the Pence and Abe, the Time magazine reported that when the joint Korea team of South Korea and North Korea was marching in, everyone in the stand stood up and applauded for that, except Pence and Abe, right? So in South Korea also covered that Pence and Abe said stone-faced and entire people stood to applaud the joint team. And you also, I'm sure, have seen these pictures that South Korea, a lot of South Koreans were doing anti-North demonstrations and rallies while there is this Olympic of Peace happening, and there's so much glory about it. So there are people on the streets are fighting. Have you ever wondered why do they come out with the star and the stripe? These are Korean people in Korea. Why do they, whenever they are against the North or they are talking about the North, these people are coming out, not only the South Korean flag or like burning of the North Korean flag, but you will see they bring the American flag. And why is that? And oftentimes when we didn't see how most of the masses actually were welcoming this Olympics, Pyeongchang Olympics. They, instead of sitting in their house watching it individually, everyone preferred to go into their town halls or on the streets or in a gym, and then they sat together with the flag and the loud noisemakers, and they watched it together, cheered it together. It's a very communal ways of watching the game, especially Olympics and World Cup. People go crazy over it. So another thing that I would also want to question is that I'm sure you have heard about this incident, right? When the Ramo, do you call it Ramo? He noted that the Korea's modernization is it was followed by the Japanese model. Japan is a cultural, technological, economic example that has been so important to Korea's transformation, is what he said. And then South Korea had an uproar about it. So then they had to issue an official apology, right? But it's, this is a very symbolic. I'm not sure if you realize, but US has been trying to put pressure to South Korea to build a trilateral alliances, right? Korea, South Korea, Japan, and US. They wanted to build a trilateral military alliances. I'm not sure if you have been following, but South Koreans are really mad about that. Because, as you know, South Korea was a colony of Japan for 36 years. Decolonization process, legal or compensation process did not happen so much because of the US, actually. US stopped it, and US, when they were trying to stabilize the region, they thought that, if Japanese collaborators were in power, it would be much easier for them to work with, rather than speaking to these people who does not know or who's more leaning towards the socialism at the time. So the question is, what is Korea to the U.S.? Is it an enduring and equal partnership in the face of North Korean nuclear threat, where the U.S. still retains the wartime operational control over 5 million ROK military service people? Or is it like a trading partner that Trump recently called that has taken advantage of the U.S. market and created a bigger deficit to the U.S., right? And then also Russell, because they were mentioning or referring to the Pyeongchang Olympics and dealing directly with the South Korea and North Korea together, he warned South Korea that not to run off the leash. So what is Korea to the U.S. is a question. And this is the sample about so-called allies. They are not the allies in trade. And U.S. South Korea and Japan and China are trying to take advantage of the United States. South Korea is ranked at 12 out of the 133 countries in military power. So, and also South Korea, as you may know, is a part of G20. I didn't have a G20 list. I had a G20 list and I guess I took it out. So, why isn't Korea to be entrusted with its own control over its own military? Why does U.S. still have to retain in 2018, currently at this time, Koreans cannot have a wartime control? Is this an equal partner because it's an equal partner, or is it because Korea is so important to the U.S.? U.S. does not want to give it to South Korea? And I also note that yes, there is a deficit with South Korea. But what he did, the countries that he didn't mention, U.S. does not have anywhere they make a profit out of or make a flat with any other countries. There is always a deficit in the foreign trade. Canada, for example, has a minus 17 billion. U.S., South Korea has 22, it's a $4 billion difference. And Japan has a minus 68 billion. That's the deficit they have. And why is the South Korea has to go, it's a picked, right? And then free trade agreement that Trump is describing it as if it's only benefiting South Korea. Though it benefits a lot on the US too, even if you hear about what South Koreans are saying, South Korean governments are saying. So US-Korea relations are a little bit complicated. It's a very complicated actually. And it has a very multifaceted relationship. You cannot just simply say, oh, they are allies. Ally relationship also can be complicated too, but there is more to that. And I'm gonna try to do that with you tonight. So the first contact was made in, I'm gonna go back to 1800s. 1866, General Sherman came at a gunpoint, said, open up, we want to trade with you. Before that, actually French came. And then, so Korea had to go through a war. It's a time of East Asian country, the East Asia and largely South Asia, there was a Western imperialist advances into that region, right? So you have to understand it into a larger geopolitical, advances of the Western countries coming in. Not only the US at the time, but it was Britain, Spain, France, they were all trying to go into these unknown territories and claim it as their own, and subjugate or like dominate the trade, or they were trying to play the dominance and power game among these established countries. So they came, and then there was a war. So to retaliate, 5 years later or 6 years later, they came again, and then killed the entire soldiers that was facing 650. It's a small island also. It was called reported as a Korea expedition. In Korea, we learned it as a Gangpa massacre. That without any provocation by Koreans, these foreign ships came and then started to try to come in and attack. So this is how we began our relationship. But it was okay for the U.S. to do so in Japan. It's the same thing. It's not like Korea was only target. They went to Japan and did it in 1853, 7, and it was received. They lost, and then it led to Meiji Restoration. So then, Japan was quickly becoming westernized, and they were building the factories, and they sent delegations out to U.S. U.S. sent there was an exchange of the knowledge. It was good. In Korea, because of the internal problems and external foreign relations were having some rocky points at the time, they didn't want to open up. So then we got the nickname of a hermit kingdom, because we wanted not to communicate. But that was only then, Anyway, so, oh yeah, I already talked about this. So, at the time, in the early 19th century, late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, Korea, there were so many foreign troops and forces and missionaries and the Catholic priests and Baptist missionaries, and everyone was in Korea. And people were trying to make adjustment. And it's kind of hard because, it's a very different culture, very different language, and very different customs, and maybe the people who were outside thought that Koreans are really uncivilized. Anyway, so they thought the missionaries with the good intentions, I'm sure, they thought that maybe let's send them to the U.S. and have them work there and make a better life and more money. But anyway, they sent about 7,000 laborers, workers, the plantation workers were sent from South Korea from Korea, in general, the national Korea. It was known as a Joseon at the time. But the bachelor who were receiving party, he was a representative of Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association. And then they were already having problems with the Chinese laborers. And then the next influx was the Japanese workers, farm workers. And because the working conditions were so bad that they were trying to have a strike. So to break the strike, they thought, okay, let's bring another group of people in. And that's the Korea. So that's how the Korean immigration to the U.S. began. And that's a lot of the Korean Americans refer to January 13, 1903 as the beginning of our immigration into the U.S. And that's the picture. Well, wherever, at the time, they thought they are just temporarily here and then they will go back to Korea. So they built their own school, and this is the school picnic picture. Anyway, another one that the 1905 is important is that, so as I said, there is the Soviet Union, the Russians were in South Korea. Chinese army were in Korea. Germans, British, Japanese, and the US. So the US and Japan thought that the Chinese and Russians are coming down is a little bit too much of a threat. So let's make a pact and let's trade. So they sort of traded between Philippines and Korea. So then Japan said, okay, I respect your control in Philippines. Instead, keep your hands off of Korea. It's us. So then they kind of traded their colonies. And that's called the Taft and Katsura Memorandum. And in South Korea, this is really important. Like, you learn in the high school. When I came here and talked to people didn't know about this at all. And I was like, why is that? Why? So that's like the colonization of Japan in Korea was under the approval of the U.S. is I guess what I'm trying to say. The U.S. knew about it, and they kind of promoted so that Japan would not be interested, would not come out to Philippines. It's a trade between Japan and the U.S. They said, okay, you take Korea, I take Philippines, So a whole another story about the colonization period. A lot of people think that just because Japan surrendered after the dropping of the atomic bombs, that Korea automatically gained liberation. And if you say that, they will be met with the fury and wrath on the South Korean or North Korean for the same reason. Because approximately half of the population died during that period, trying to, as a freedom fighters or independence fighters. They were workers who were sabotaging and doing the strike. There was an effort, serious effort made by the Koreans for 36 years to try to gain their own independence. And then all of a sudden World War, not all of a sudden, but World War II ended and Koreans were liberated. Before Korea was liberated, though, the US was already at the time, 1945, were going into doing this anti-communist campaign. The Soviet Union was getting larger, and US is, from the standpoint of the US as a country, they were really trying to minimize or isolate already of the Soviet Union. So there was a conference in Potsdam, and they talked about how to divide. So to disarm the Japanese soldiers in Korea Peninsula, how can we divide up? The US did not make an entry yet into the war nearby the Korean Peninsula. So they had two colonels suggest divide up Korea. And surprisingly, even to the U.S., they agreed. Soviet agreed to it because Soviet was not really interested in expanding down into the East Asia or East Asia yet. And that 38th parallel is very similar to the demarcation line right now. And that, unfortunately, no Koreans took a part of it, or no Koreans knew about this arbitrary line across the 38th parallel. Okay, so after 1 month later, about 3 weeks later, Korea was liberated, officially liberated. The U.S. enters Korea. So from the August 15, 1945 is the liberation day. Everyone kind of celebrates. within that 2 weeks, you will notice that the Committee for the Preparation of Korea Independence was formed as a national level. And then 145 branches in 13 provinces, entire Korean peninsula, were established during that same period. So you can see that from the long before, people were organizing and they were already communicating. They were getting ready to take the land over, take the control. They were so eager to build a newer, better society, so to speak. But unfortunately, General Hodge at the time heard from the Japanese officers who were controlling that colonized land in Korean Peninsula that Koreans tend to be communist friendly, and they are more of they are orienting themselves to the socialist. Because a lot of people, at the time we were feudal society, so the people were tied into the land. If you don't have a land, then you are really poor. So then, socialist ideas and ideals and this text were really a kind of a new thing for masses of Koreans. And of course, the socialist, the egalitarian ways of possession, really people kind of tend to wanted to try that out. And that's why I guess there is a reason, I guess, General Hodge may have been right. It potentially communist friendly, and then decided to forcibly disbanded all these committees. So eventually it got disbanded. But then, instead, so then they turned who they are going to pick as a people who they are going to entrust with the power is the people who are educated, elites, and then landowners, who happen to be also collaborators with the Japanese under the Japanese colonization. And this is the notes is a really illuminating. The most encouraging single factor in the political situation in Korea is the presence of several hundred conservatives among the older and better educated Koreans. Although many of them served the Japanese, that stigma ought eventually to disappear, is what they thought. That stigma is still residing in people's mind, and it brings out such an, unfortunately, resentment too. Conservative elites and landowners, the US favored and exempted from punishment, were for good reasons extremely unpopular with most Koreans. It directly undermined the Korean people's wish for justice, liberation, and social change. So this direct intervention of giving the power to ex-Japanese collaborators, and accordingly, the people who are in the power now still are the descendants of the Japanese collaborators, made most Koreans very bitter and not trusting the people in power or the government. And that's one significant step that U.S. took in the wrong direction in Korean modern history. So anyway, as you most know, the Sigmund Rhee, because Hodge thought, oh, he's from the U.S., he was educated in Princeton, let's make him the president. So the Sigmund Rhee became the president and then became a dictator, and he didn't step down from the presidency for 3 long terms that he designated. And because he's a very strongly anti-communist, the first president, Sigmund Rhee, unfortunately I share the same name, same last name. Maybe my ancestors, I don't know what my ancestors, sorry. But, so people had some doubts. A lot of people had some doubts about, is the US true liberators and freedom fighters as they say they are, or is it just a selfish superpower who does not know anything about history? Maybe somebody should go and tell them. So then, people sent a lot of times people sent delegations to the US just to tell the truth. No, these people are not to be, trusted. Comparatively speaking, in the North, they were able to do the land reform. They were able, because during the war, actually, a lot of landowners came down. Okay. So, okay, let's just skip that. That's important, but that's North Korea. It's a fight between South Korea and North Korea up until 1987. It's about legitimacy. Who's really representing the Korean interest? Or like who's keeping the Korean pride? Those things may not be really important in our economic life, but in Korea, because it's the colonization and the war and the domination of the superpower is so new still that pride aspects and legitimacy aspect plays a really important role when you are dealing between South Korea and North Korea relations. They still consider themselves as a one country. In the US and in the recent poll says that South Koreans do not want a reunification. The poll, you have to always see the sample. Who are they sampling? If they are only sampling the people who are in their 20s and 30s, who grew up under the conservative administration, the recent 10 years of Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, then they tend to say, well, economic betterness is the most important. If my job is at stake, why do we have to worry about the reunification? It's not the most urgent thing. But if you go over that generation, over 30, and if you sample only them, majority of the people, usually over 67%, are in favor of reunification without giving a precondition. So in the next time, we'll talk about that, other things too. So anyway, I want to also point out that, to support that theory of US hegemony in Korean Peninsula is the thing that US is seeking, is that the peacetime operation control was transferred to South Korea in 1994, even after the Olympics. That's, and as I said, so what justifies this maintenance of the control of the military? Another thing that you have to think with this military control is, so then whenever there was a massacre of the dictator, of the military on the citizens or civilians, the US had an idea or the information about it. Because in order to move the military, the troops from one location to the other location, there has to be a prior authorization. So the coup, the military actions in Gwangju massacre, in Busan massacre, all these massacres where the military killed the civilians, the US is not free of the blame, unfortunately, because US had the control. The command was under the US's hand. So it's not like, the dictators were only there and doing their own thing. Dictator had a full support of the US government because they were, they were friendly to the US interest and friendly to the US. And people kind of knew about that. the colonized, I'm not sure if you also read about the colonized mind, that there is this envy and fear. Envy and fear at the same time, right? There is a fear and there is a hate, but then there is an envy and there is a jealousy that they want to be like, you know. It's like a Stockholm syndrome, or that's how the workings are working. So in South Koreans, yesterday, the Korean National Assembly got together. They were going to issue a statement under the name of the National Assembly, which is a Congress. They wanted to express that their unhappiness about the Trump's remark about tariff, 50% increase in the tariff of the metal trade. And then the Conservative Party disagreed with issuing the statement because they were worried. Officially, they said what they worried about was the retaliation from the U.S. could be greater. They would be more, you know, it could annoy them more, so that we can get bigger retaliation. And maybe the current administration is doing something wrong, so the U.S. is trying to punish, is the logic, the discussion. And then people, you know, a lot of news commentators were like, you know, why, as a nation to nation, if, you know, the agreement was upturned, why couldn't we say something about it? Why do we have to worry about bigger retaliations if it's a partnership, you know? So the people who are coming out with a American flag, the star and the stripe, is trying to appease the U.S. or showing the U.S. that there are people and support, so that, you know, don't, yeah.
No, what?
So they are trying to appease them so that there will be no retaliation, there will be no military action, there will be no military coming to get them eventually. It's a fear of persecution. South Korea has also suffered more than 30 years of military dictatorship under, you know, as a police state as well, right? Under Park Chung-hee and under Chun Doo-han and up to Roh Tae-woo. So that could be our mentality, I think. Otherwise, I would not be able to explain why people are coming out with an American flag. The national security law is another thing the U.S. also supported. 1948, we enacted the infamous national security law. And under November to, in only within the period of 6 months, less than 6 months, 60,000 people were arrested, incarcerated, tortured, and executed. The national security law is like a counter-terrorist act. It's not. Yeah, yes.
We could have had Juyeon for the entire evening.
I know.
So I'm sorry to cut you off. Maybe we'll leave a little of the rest for the Q&A.
Yeah. We should. I'm just gonna say one thing, is that what I was trying to get at was well, I also want to talk about that people's resistance and movement, but you know, I'm sure there will be another opportunities and you can hear all about it. It's just that, you know, you also, whenever you're questioning about is North Korea trustworthy, you always have to think, South Koreans are saying, is US trustworthy this time? Are they gonna keep their bargain this time? You know, that's not only the North Korea. Also, South Koreans are saying the same thing. And that's the question that, you know, you also have to place yourselves onto the other person's shoe. Okay. Sorry for the loud.
So, Bill?
Yes.
Thank you so much. We'll have time for Q&A afterwards, and you're going to be able to speak with people as well, and we'll hopefully have you come back for more of a, more I can see you have like a lot more to share with us, so thank you so much.
It's good. I yield the rest of my time. You can come and finish. Because I learned a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit about the prospects for war and prospects for peace. And I don't pretend to have some unique answer that you haven't heard before, but I think it's good to walk through it anyway. I think even the non-insane officers in the U.S. military understand that a war in Korea would be a disaster. There is no military solution to the North Korean nuclear issue. Even a conventional war would cause tens or hundreds of thousands of deaths because Seoul is close to the North Korean border. They have many conventional missiles. Even if North Korea were to be defeated, it would be at a huge price in South Korean lives, lives of the United States troops, and so forth. And this notion that somehow they could have a precision strike and eliminate only the nuclear facilities. Of course, you know, as peace activists, you've heard that term many, many times before, being in Vietnam, being in Iraq, and we understand that there are no precision strikes, that there's always collateral damage, which means civilians being killed. And furthermore, U.S. intelligence doesn't actually know where these things are, so even if they wanted to eliminate them with airstrikes, they wouldn't be able to do it. So the Pentagon had a study that was leaked that said basically the only way to get rid of the North Korean nuclear weapons would be a ground invasion, which many of them are not willing to undertake. So we have some problematic figures like H.R. McMaster, who thinks that they can launch what he calls a bloody nose strike, which basically means, well, we'll just show him what we've got. You know, we'll attack him, he'll back off, and all will be well for the United States and Korea. And of course, that's not what's going to happen. It would be a very unpredictable situation. As soon as the strike occurs, we don't know how they're going to retaliate. We don't know how it's going to escalate. And the idea that somebody who's purportedly a professional military officer would even think of such a thing is a little bit shocking. And there's this notion that, you know, Kim Jong-un is crazy, you can't deal with him, what's with this person, and so forth. There's some similarly questionable thinking on the U.S. side of the equation, which is never treated as such in our press, of course. You know, the bottom line is we have to do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen. And it means speaking out in every way possible, getting our members of Congress to make noise, and doing what we can in all the ways we can think of to make people understand that this is not a war that we can allow to begin. The other thing that to think about is that I think a lot of Americans think that the choice is either to get rid of Kim Jong-un and his nukes, or the United States will be attacked. That essentially our lives are at risk. And if you saw the false alarm in Hawaii and how people reacted to that, clearly a lot of people feel that way. But William Perry, who was Secretary of Defense under Clinton, who did some of the negotiations that actually paused the North Korean nuclear program for about a decade, has basically said there's no way in hell that Kim Jong-un would attack the United States because he has 15 or 20 nuclear weapons. He's not even sure that they could reach here reliably. The United States has 4,000, any of which could reach North Korea. And he may be a dictator, but he's not suicidal. There's no way being a dictator if you're going to die, because it's not nearly as fun as, you know, being a dictator. So the point that Perry made is the only way there's likely to be a conventional nuclear war in the Korean Peninsula is through miscalculation. And we're at very high risk of that because Kim Jong-un and Trump are trading insults. You know, so when Trump says it's going to be fire and fury, the likes of which you've never seen before, my first reaction is, you know, like he spoke a complete sentence. But unfortunately, it's not a sentence we want to hear. Of course, he had to tweet about my button is larger than your button. And, actually it's not controlled by a button, but maybe if he thinks it is, we're safer, It's actually, secret codes in the suitcase. But anyway, he was being metaphorical. My button's bigger than your button, and my button works. So if you're sitting on the other side of that, how do you know when this guy is just mouthing off? And how do you know when he's about to attack you? So a lot of people say, well, with Trump, don't listen to what he says. That's the sideshow. Just watch what he does. But when he's talking about nuclear weapons, that doesn't apply. Because those threats can be taken as real. And if Kim Jong-un thinks that he's about to be attacked, that's probably the only circumstance under which he would try to attack Korea or Japan or the United States. So the rhetoric matters in this case. There's sort of this is more recent history than we've heard, because I don't know all the history that you were presenting. But certainly in the post-Cold War period, North Korea is often used as an example of a threat that is used to justify lots of nuclear weapons on the part of the United States, lots of military spending. Basically, we wouldn't be spending, close to $1 trillion a year on all different manner of homeland security and the Pentagon and all the other, security-related functions of the United States government if people weren't afraid of something, And at the end of the Cold War, Colin Powell said, once the Soviet Union dissolved, he said, well, I'm kind of running out of enemies here, I got Cuba, I got North Korea, I got nothing, And so what they did was they rejiggered their strategy for what they called two major regional conflicts. One was with Iraq, and one was with North Korea. And then, of course, Bush gave his Axis of Evil speech, where he tried to make it sound like Iran, Iraq, North Korea were some sort of unified force whose only purpose was to attack and undermine the United States of America. And Trump's UN speech that he gave last fall had similar rhetoric and a similar feel to it, sort of another Axis of Evil speech, essentially. And so, to some degree, the U.S. military establishment, the military industrial complex, needs North Korea to be an enemy, because it's that climate of fear that allows them to pick our pockets for all those billions and billions of dollars. And in fact, a lot of the stock analysts have been saying this. They said, well, as long as this Korea conflict continues, it's good times for Lockheed Martin and Boeing, Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics and all the weapons contractors. One guy told the Washington Post, he said, well, airstrikes are in and diplomacy's out. So, it's happy days are here again if you're a military contractor. So you have sort of those prophets of fear. And I'm being brief because I just am. But the question is, what's the way forward? And I think the bias in our news is that somehow North Korea is unreliable, diplomacy is impossible, force is almost inevitable. And you'll see this in small ways, like the Olympic truce and the unification of the Olympic teams and the discussions between North and South. The New York Times described it as it was this wily Kim Jong-un trying to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea. Well, if the United States' position is to start a war in the Korean Peninsula, I'm all for the wedge. I mean, the point was that the Korean leadership was taking it upon itself to chart a different course, a diplomatic course, which is much more promising and much less dangerous. And so if that means that they're out in front of what Donald Trump would like to do, I'm behind that 100%. And so the question becomes, how do we gauge where we are? Given Trump's kind of bluster, his rhetoric, his kind of inconsistency. And you'll see this, some of his people, like Secretary of State Tillerson or Secretary of Defense Mattis, will make points about, well, of course, we wouldn't use force. First, we'll explore all diplomatic options. And then Trump will tweet, oh, Rex, forget about that. Little rocket man is just, he's not going to negotiate with us. And so, so you never quite know when Trump is going to upset any ability to make a real diplomatic connection. But I think it is possible to be done. Certainly under Clinton, North Korea was willing to negotiate, but there had to be certain conditions. First of all, let's start with an open mind. It's not, the Trump position has been, and many times, get rid of your nuclear weapons and then we'll talk. But their position is also, we're going to wipe you off the face of the earth, which is not a reason to get rid of your nuclear weapons. So it's got to be from a position of no preconditions, no threat of regime change, and then gradual steps. We'll lift sanctions in exchange for, say, a freeze in the nuclear program. We'll pull back on the military exercises, which are quite menacing. Not only do they use nuclear-capable bombers, but one of the things they practice is what they call a decapitation strike, in other words, murdering Kim Jong-un. So you can understand why he's upset about this. And we were talking before about when he threatened to send a missile near Guam, which is a major U.S. base. It seemed kind of extreme, but it's no more extreme than the U.S. flying nuclear bombers close to North Korean soil, or having exercises where they're practicing to assassinate the leader of that country. You could imagine if any country did that anywhere near the borders of the United States, how our government would react. So this notion that on one side you've got this kind of crazy dictator, and on the other side you've got this rational country, unfortunately doesn't apply in the current situation. And that's why it's harder to predict how it's going to play out. But I do believe, because many in the professional military understand there's no military solution, because there's been a success of diplomacy before, under the Clinton approach, which William Perry, I mentioned before, was in the middle of, and Jimmy Carter actually kicked off at a moment when it seemed like war was imminent. That lasted for 10 years. And the only reason it stopped was actually when Bush came in. They had been on the verge of a deal to get rid of North Korea's nuclear bombs and nuclear missile production capability. And Clinton ran out of time. Colin Powell, carried over into the Bush administration, and he said, this is a good process, we should continue it. And virtually overnight, all the neocons who brought us the Iraq War, among many other shameful things they've done, basically cut Colin Powell off the knee, said we can't talk to these people. John Bolton was in the middle of this effort. And Powell had to go back and say, oh, yeah, I guess we're not talking, And it's all the times when they haven't talked, when the North Korean nuclear program has mushroomed. All the times that there have been talks, when there's been negotiations, when there's been an honest back and forth, the program has been limited and curbed. And now we're in a much different situation, of course, because they have 15 or 20 nuclear weapons, they have missiles that are improving. So if anything, if I were leading a U.S. initiative, I would be a little more humble about it. I wouldn't sort of lead with all this bluster that Trump seems to be so fond of. There is some action in Congress, not as much as we need, but there's a couple bills. I know a couple were mentioned on the board. There's a related bill by Chris Murphy of Connecticut that basically says Congress will not appropriate funds for a first strike on North Korea. It's got 8 or 10 co-sponsors, including Kirsten Gillibrand, not Charles Schumer, who always has to be kicking and dragging into these kinds of things. But it would be a big thing if we were to bring him over, because he would bring others with him. And then there's a similar measure in the House. Representative Ro Khanna of California has been a leader on many issues, including against the U.S. war in Yemen and other peace issues. And he has 67 co-sponsors, including many New York reps. Not all of them, but people like Yvette Clarke and Joe Nadler, and there's at least half a dozen New York reps on that bill. But every representative in the New York area, New York State should be on that bill, and they shouldn't just be, Congress has a zillion bills, and you can sign on to something, and that's the end of it. Or you can sign on to it, you can fight for it, you can talk about it, you can speak out every time there's a misleading press account, when the president makes an inflammatory statement. the last thing we want is the impression that people are going to sit still for this. And so I think if we're going to bother to elect these people, we should force them to take place in leadership role in this particular issue, because there's more at stake than in many of the other conflicts that we've fought against in our lifetimes. That may be the gist of what I had to say. So we could do Q&A, or we could yield the floor back and you could finish your PowerPoint.
Yeah, why don't you stay there, Bill, and Juyeon, why don't you come back up? Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to give you the chance to donate towards the cost of this event. And I think Sam and Charlene have our donation buckets, which I'll circulate. All of our events are free to the public, and both of our speakers are coming without honoraria. But these events do cost money, so please give as generously as you can to continue to do events like this and other kinds of work that need to be done. I'd like to call your attention to a few upcoming events. March 18th will be this fabulous play, Extreme Weather, which, if you haven't seen it, it's a great play to see, or if you have seen it, please see it again. It's a powerful drama bringing to life the struggle of climate scientists. And besides getting your own ticket, please help us reach out to new audiences to build awareness of the urgency of climate change through art. And we'll have these cards at the front desk also, so please take some, put them up in your neighborhood, and try to get other people to come with you as well. Excuse me? Yes, Karen Malpeat is a member of Brooklyn for Peace. Then looking ahead to March, on Monday, March 19th, we'll be back in this space for a forum on Palestinian resistance and the international solidarity movement. So please take a flyer and put it on your calendar. Also, let me mention we have the flyer, the posters at the front desk. Refugees and immigrants are welcome here, which we're asking a donation of $3. But the main thing is you'll take one and put one up in your window or in some place in your neighborhood. These are throughout the neighborhood, and it's really important in creating a climate of public opinion. The refugees and immigrants are in fact welcome here, and that's, as you I'm sure are aware, is more important than ever. So the other action which you can take tomorrow is the one that Bill just mentioned, to call Congress and tell our Congress people to do their job. And we'll post these particular bills on our website tonight, so you can look at them tomorrow morning, and please make these calls tomorrow, and also let people know it's important to let Congress know that we're watching what they're doing. So thank you all for your donations, and now we will take questions. So let's see, maybe I'll start over here. So please make your question brief and your question more than a statement.
Did you call me?
I called on you.
Oh, thank you. So I know the history is really fantastic, but I feel that one thing that we really need to focus in on was what the United States did to North Korea during the war. In other words, from what I understand, the numbers of dead, the numbers of, there wasn't a building standing, and the numbers of bombs attacked on North Korea is just something that people don't really know the figures about. And then you think about why the North Koreans, have some type of hatred or some type of don't trust the United States. It was an incredible war crime.
Maybe you can just repeat the question before you answer.
Yeah, the question was what U.S. did to North Korea during the Korean War. Yeah, so it was, they said the napalm bombing was done, and then a lot of, they said the total amount of the napalm that was used during the World War II, it was twice as much of the bomb was dropped into the North Korea only. So there was, as he said, there was no wall standing. There was only one building that had standing up in Pyongyang. It was total rubble after the war. And then there was a lot of massacre of civilians. The people said, even in South Korea, in northern Rhee, people at the time, it was farmers, I said, right? And then also the dye was not very popular, so people wore white clothes. So the white clothes was a symbol of the civilians. But then, which means that if you wear white clothes, then you can pretend to be civilians. So US soldiers had a difficulty in recognizing who's a civilian and who's actually a soldier, pretending to be civilian. And that was the logic behind killing of all the villagers whenever the troops went down. Because it's 86% of entire Korean peninsula is mountainous area. It's easy to hide. The guerrilla warfare was very popular at the time also. So total of the 10% of the Koreans were killed in South Korea, but about 25% of the entire population was wiped out in North Korea. So
The statistics are even higher, up to 50%.
Between the two of you, I heard bias in the news, I heard misleading news reports that need to be corrected, and I heard a lot of how come you don't know. So one question is, where do we go to get news about Korea, particularly corrected and untold news? And that's sort of also a plug for the forum that we're having on March 4th, where do you go to get your news? The other thing I want to ask is, I just finished watching Wormwood, which is the 6-hour documentary by Errol Morris, which is in part about Korea and biological warfare. So I'm interested in the question of biological warfare in Korea.
Well, in terms of the kinds of things that I look at, I mean, there's certain people who write for various publications, but for example, Tim Sharrock, who's been an activist, lived in Korea for quite a while, has been writing some very good things for The Nation about the prospects for peace, about the history of negotiations. So his stuff is very useful. A colleague of mine, John Pfeffer, on and off will write pieces on it for Foreign Policy in Focus. There's a publication called Low Blog, which also covers some of this stuff. I have a friend, Leon Siegel, who's more involved in kind of track 2 diplomacy with respect to the Korean nuclear issue, and he had a piece recently at BuzzFeed. He writes for CNN.com. So there are some people who are pushing back, but it's kind of an issue of volume. You know, if you read a couple of things every day and they've got that kind of bias to them and you don't have time to read 5 other sources, then your view of it is skewed. But if you seek out people who have an alternative point of view, you can eventually kind of get caught up, and then when you see the bias, you're able to correct for it, or at least be skeptical of some of the things that are being fed to you. And I think there's a couple of factors in current journalism that contribute to this problem. One is they're slashing their international news coverage. So even if somebody wanted to give an honest accounting, they don't have the resources to actually do on-the-ground reporting like they used to. Conflict sells. It's easier to get people to read the paper if they think they're going to die tomorrow than if it's like, oh, okay, they're working this out. Let me go work on my garden or something. So I think in addition to this corporate control of media, there's not many other factors, but I think there's sort of the business model of our news outlets is also biased against discussions of peace, because it's not, you're not frightening people to watch your program. It doesn't happen quickly. You sort of need patience for it. It sort of cuts against the grain of a lot of how people consume media now and how media is produced. And so somehow we have to slow that down in order to take in alternate information before we get kind of whipped up by the kind of coverage that is primarily in the mainstream.
I would recommend the Martin Hart Landsberg book on North Korea. He's really good. He's a Marxist economist, but he writes really easy to read, easy to understand perspectives. He's a little bit critical about North Korea's economic development policies at the beginning. However, it is a very fair and short and easy read. I also recommend, there is a blog called Zoom in Korea in one word. .org is a news, Korean progressive news outlet that is published in English. Also, the Korea Policy Institute, kpolicy.org, we try to update all these common articles and analysis onto, and there are a couple of organizations that has a web blog, and I think it's easy to keep up if you keep reading, as he said. That's okay, right. If you really need some kind of building block to be able to follow. I also want to mention something about biological or biochemical warfare. When I went to North Korea in 2006, I met with, I sat in the airplane, I sat by a US person, a person who's really old and weak, and he said he works at a Eugene Bell Foundation. So I said, oh, what are you doing in Korea? And they said, oh, you didn't hear about us? They are very famous in North Korea. They are, not the pneumonia, what's the disease that in the lung? Tuberculosis, thank you. So he said there is a very high incidence of tuberculosis, almost epidemic in North Korea. And they think it's because of the biological warfare. So they had 7 clinics that for the last about 20 years, they have been running these clinics in North Korea, and they were allowed and they are funding these clinics of tuberculosis. Well, that's it.
I wondered about your opinion about the corruption scandals that toppled the previous South Korean government and the change of regime in the current government in South Korea.
Koreanist. We call the people who are watching and really know of Korean history and Korean stuff is a Koreanist. So, the candlelight revolution, they call it, as they call it, I think people are growing up, their sense of democracy, their sense of ownership. Well, Koreans are known to be persevering and feisty, I guess. I don't know if that's the good word. But under so after the military dictatorship ended, we had a first civilian president, which was DJ Kim Dae-jung. And then after that, we had Roh Moo-hyun, who soon after his end of his presidency, he committed suicide. And then it went to the conservatives. And then the Lee Myung-bak is the first one, and then it was Park Geun-hye. We had the Park Geun-hye. And then by then, for the in Korea, because of the dictatorship experience, they cannot run for the second term. It's only single term, and it's 5 years long. So Park Geun-hye had a little more to go, and people were saying that all these corruptions from the beginning, when she had a election, there was a use of national security, national intelligence services meddling with the electoral process. There was a lot of accusation and rumors, but no prosecutor would go into doing the investigation. And then people decided to come out and then do the rally, but peacefully. Because under the Lee Myung-bak, they used a water cannon, which killed one farmer, right? Because people were directing it at people. Then he flew and then had a concussion. So, what do I think of that? I think it's a quiet change. The justice, people are really, nowadays, because of the internet media and that there's much more information is accessible, people are not relying on the major news channels anymore, and they are creating their own content. And it becomes very fast to become famous. There is a podcast by this one guy who they said that the listener audience is about 10 million. And that's a very common thing. If they say these people it has a good perspective, then everyone hears it and then they write about it. It's like a Facebook, but there is a DC Inside. I don't know why the name is a DC Inside, but it's a DC Inside. And that's also another portal that people share their own stories. So there are a lot of this forum, they call it forum, the places where they can share their opinions and the informations. And the instant messaging system really helped the people mobilize, like, avoiding all these police lines, and they got together and then they marched together. So I think there is a heightened alert of the South Korean people now trying to know more and be more active, especially for the people who are in their 40s and 50s. They went through the 1987 revolution, the June uprising, what we call it. They are the ones who had who grew up under the end of the military dictatorship and has a very interesting liberal political perspectives, and their children are all coming out, and I think it's for the better. People know. I mean, it's a diversified opinions, and then there are a lot of people who are agreeing and disagreeing, and it's not like a unified voices. But diversity is always a promotion about learning and exchange, and it's what democracy is for, right? So.
And your view of the Moon government now?
I have to say, I have to disclose that the fact that I was banned actually to go to South Korea because of the threat. Well, previously under I think Charlotte said there is a video that is uploaded in their website. One of the Nodutdol member came and spoke about, the recent Korean history, and he covered about the THAAD. So THAAD is a terminal high altitude missile defense facility machine that is really expensive, about $1.6 billion. Now the Trump is saying that Korea should pay. But before that, 1 year ago, they said, we'll install it and we'll give it to you, and you just need to provide the facility. That we were organizing the peace delegation, and then I was banned. I got kicked out of South Korea, and then only the members of delegation went in. Ever since then, I was banned every year, so I haven't gone back for 3 years now. So Moon administration unfortunately extended my ban. So I was like really disappointed at the time. I thought, things have changed. And then people said, no, give them more time. Your ban will be lifted very soon. Although he had a 70% of approval rating at the beginning, and now it went down to 67%. There is this upbeat people who comes out every rally, a couple of hundred people, or sometimes nationally 1,000 maximum. These people who comes with a flag, who supports the conservative parties, the past president, ex-president, and he is a little bit like, in terms of foreign policies and in terms of U.S. relations, I think he's a little bit hesitant, or like he's known to be quiet and quiet and patient about it. So I don't know. It's like at the beginning of Obama administration, I had a lot of hope for change for the better. Then by the end of the second term of Obama, I said, okay, I don't think that anything will be changing. So I hope, still have a hope about, hopefully, as he goes along and then goes into his midterm, he will be more bold about his positions and reform of a lot of different things. But he has a lot to do. A lot to do. I want you to talk about the freeze to freeze a little bit.
Oh, sure. So an idea that's been floated as a way to get negotiations going is freeze U.S. military exercises, North Korea freeze its program, don't do any tests during that period. And the Pentagon's been they've dug their heels in about that. They say these exercises are essential to defense cooperation with South Korea and so forth. And so there's actually been some flexibility on the North Korean side in the sense that they've said, well, if you get rid of the most objectionable aspects of the exercises, like flying nuclear bombers, like practicing assassinating our leader, not really very onerous demands, that might be sufficient to get conversation going. So it's not even, they're not even asking to stop the exercises in whole. They're just saying rein in the most aggressive, in-your-face aspects of the exercises. So it kind of flips that question on its head about who's being reasonable and who's being unreasonable on this particular issue.
I've always been curious how the Korean War started. It went under the UN flag and UN mandate. How did it manage to get that? How did the US manage to get that since it has to go through Security Council? Did the Soviet Union veto, or what did it go through Security Council? How did it get UN mandate?
Bruce Cummings wrote a Origin of Korean War, and that's this thick of volume.
Bill, give her the mic.
I'll take the mic.
So Bruce Cummings wrote a two thick volumes of a book that is only about the origin of Korean War. I don't know how to simply say that. It's a good question, because Korean War is the only war that UN Army fought.
Well, I know the answer. I know the answer.
Oh, here's the answer.
The answer is the Soviet Union had walked out of the Security Council and was boycotting. So they weren't present for the vote.
Yeah, but then how did the UN were so quickly be able to form the army, and then how does let's not go back, go there. I mentioned about the freeze to freeze because the military exercise is coming up. So the Trump and the Moon agreed to postpone it until the end of the Paralympics. And Paralympics will start on March 8th, March 10th, and then end on March 18th, I think. So then the military exercise is starting maybe after that. So for now, it's like a peaceful thing, and there's a hope for the more exchange, and we have no idea what's going to happen next month. So this is the time, I think, people have to really raise the question. I don't know, do you know how many military personnel are involved in the key reserve military exercise that is happening in March every single year?
100,000.
Anyone else? 100,000. It's 250,000. 250,000. And about 200 of South Koreans, Japan, even from the Australia, the ships and militaries are coming. And he's really right because our plan, that's called an our plan 5027 is to decapitate, 5015 is to bomb strategic places like Yeongbyon or the known to be the nuclear facilities. 50, so 50 is all about how to kill, how to attack, how to land, you know. So it has a name and it really has a specific play. It simulates first by computer and then people carry it out. It's done in that right at the border. It's very close, as you know, South Korea and North Korea. So at the time, I was told that North Koreans do not sleep in their sleepwear during the 1.5 months of the military exercise. They are recommended to sleep in their clothes so that just in case they have to run to the underground, they can. You know, it's a drill that they, also that maybe, you know, it's a drill that creates a fear inside the people. It's easy, it's hard to have a democracy when there is a fear. But the fear is real because the incursion happened, the skirmish happens all the time in the West Sea, right? The bombing and shelling happens, exchange of fire happens. So even next week, there are people, the march is coming up, and people are a little bit getting anxious. So in Korea, then there's a national call for street rallies and you know, hearings for postponing further and calling for the freeze to freeze unconditionally because Trump wants to put the condition saying, you need to give up your nuclear program totally. You know, what was that? Verifiably, something. There is this irreversibly, and you know, all these R words that they used. You know, they have to do that in order to start negotiation. And what's the guarantee that for peace that North Korea can trust before they come up? There's nothing for them to gain by coming up to the peace negotiation if there is nothing that guarantees them for peace and security before they give up the nuclear. So it's going around. They know, US knows about that too. That's why they are putting those conditions. So our demand is without preconditions. People, both sides has to come and do the peace negotiation, and then start from there. We need to build the trust before we start to actually negotiate and talk about the peace, right? So freeze to freeze, but without preconditions, and both sides has to make a real effort to keep their ends of deal.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention, and maybe it's kind of obvious, but Kim Jong-un paid close attention to what happened in Iraq and Libya, where they either stopped nuclear development, or in the case of Libya, actually got rid of their nuclear weapons, and the dictators were killed. So he's not going to come to the table disarmed, knowing the history of the United States. So the idea that somehow that's a reasonable demand doesn't really hold up to recent history.
I don't know.
Hi, I'm Diane. I don't understand why North Korea would be demanded to give up its nuclear weapons, even unconditionally or in any other circumstance, when we Americans are placing a THAAD missile directed at them. So what would their motivation be to give up anything? It sounds like it's a no-win situation. Can't be won because U.S. is not going to remove the THAAD missile. So why would North Korea be moved in any way to destroy their own defense?
I think that THAAD missile is a missile defense system Maybe you can say a little bit more about that, as why it is, although it's called a defense system, it really is part of an offensive program.
Well, similar to what happened during the Cold War, there's this notion of a balance of forces. If one side believes that if they attack the other side, they'll be destroyed, they're less likely to attack. But if you think of it sort of like as a sword and a shield, if you have a shield and you think you can keep the other country from attacking you, you are therefore more able to threaten the first strike. So since both sides have nuclear weapons, were the THAAD system to be capable of knocking out the North Korean nukes, then they would feel more vulnerable. And it's not really clear if this thing works or not, but the point is militaries think in worst case scenarios. So they assume, well, what if it did work? Then they could block our nuclear capability and they could attack us with impunity, and therefore the only way around that is for us to have more nuclear weapons, and that's how arms races spiral upward. That's why the US and the Soviet Union in the 70s had the anti-ballistic missile treaty, because they said, all right, these defensive systems back and forth are just forcing us to build more and more and more nuclear weapons, and if we put a lid on that, then maybe we can actually stop that upward growth of nukes and start bringing it down again. So I think it's a difficult concept because most people are, well, it's defensive, how bad could it be? But it's the context in which it's being used that's the problem.
So in Korea, they say that it supports the U.S. is the first to strike. So let's say, think about that. If the U.S. attacks first, then if they had a missile, let's say, just for the sake of argument, it's China. The U.S. shoots the missile to China. China retaliates. Then our missile defense system will be able to block their missiles coming in. So it allows us to be able to attack first or do the first strike without worrying about retaliation. It gives us an upper superior position. So that's why US missile defense is actually a very offensive system. And that's what US wants South Korea to be part of. So that because we are closer to the China. And then that is not, I'm not sure about that, but in Korea they are saying that, THAAD system is terminal. So terminal is when the missile gets launched, this is a terminal stage when it's coming down.
So it's at full speed.
Right, it's full speed and it's coming in. And that's when, from South Korea to be able to terminally hit, has to be further away. It's further away. South Korea and North Korea is, it's a size of, it's a size close to North Carolina maybe? Or like 1.2 times over Maine. So it's a small country, so within that, South Korea and North Korea, they don't even have to use the it's just a Scud missile would be able to just be fine. It's not about North Korea, it's about China. Or missiles that is going to across the Pacific to the US. And that's what South Korea is saying, that why the South has to be in Korean soil.
Well, and the lives of South Koreans are the ones that are being put at risk. So they're being drawn into this nuclear confrontation in a way that puts them at more risk than even citizens here are.
I want to make sure I understood this. Bill, are you saying that the only reason the U.S. is doing this is for around military industrial complex people to get rich, or is there some other reason that they think? And then the other part of my question, I think you've given us a good sense of what's happening in South Korea and in the U.S., but I'm still I hardly know anything about North Korea. And I think a lot of people in the U.S. accept the argument that there's no military solution and it would be really dangerous to have a war there, either a conventional or a nuclear war. But the other part of it is I think there's been so much description in the news about how crazy Kim is and how out of control. What I would like to know is,
a little more about North Korea and about him. Like, is he really dangerous? Is he as much of an egotist and dictator as they say? And what is the economic situation in North Korea? Are people really poor? Like, are these blockades working? Or is China doing enough trade so people are kind of, you know, not that poor? I want to know more about North Korea.
Yeah, I don't think it's just about the military-industrial complex, but I think what they do is there's tensions in the world that exist. They tend to heighten them in terms of the way they're fed back to the public. And then that heightened level of fear is able to fuel higher Pentagon budgets. But, you know, Kim Jong-un is really a real potential threat. I mean, there are nuclear weapons in China, in Russia. There's all kinds of security problems like terrorism and so forth. And the US government has a very militarized view of how to solve those problems, which has been a disaster throughout this century. If you look at the results of the Iraq War and the Afghan War, and now the 7 wars that the United States is fighting at least around the world. So I think there is kind of like a strategic or ideological aspect that says, you know, the way to defend the United States is what they call it forward deployment. You know, we have to be, it's like during the Iraq War they said, well, we have to kill them over there so they don't come here. But of course they weren't over there until we went there. You know, because they tried to make that link with Al-Qaeda, and that link did not exist between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. But once the US became an occupying power, then jihadist groups came in to help the resistance in Iraq. And there was an Al-Qaeda in Iraq after the US occupation, which then morphed into ISIS. So their thrust, even if you take them, assume it was an honest effort to defend the United States, it backfired disastrously. But I think there is a lot of thinking in the nuclear priesthood inside the Pentagon and amongst the generals, and kind of a long history of that the way to defend the United States is to have this global military presence. So I think some of that is not just about padding the military-industrial complex, it's just kind of this Cold War mindset that they haven't been able to let go of.
The military-industrial complex is a big part of it too. Korea spends about $800 million in buying those weapons, and you know, that US designated to buy, not the ones that they want to buy. South Korea for a long time, up to I think last year or the year before, I mean, up to last year or this, until even now, they are not supposed to have a their own missile program that goes longer than 5 kilometers or something like that. There is a limitations that South Korean militaries have that US imposes on what kind of weapons they can buy and what kinds of weapons they cannot possess. But also that, you know, presence of the US military, I think, provides the sense of security for the US corporations to go in. So there's a GM, there's a Microsoft, or these companies that goes into build a factory, they like to go to the places where US is an occupying forces. So in 1994, there was a lot of, you know, at the brink of war, right, under the, because of the nuclear crisis and, you know, all that thing was happening, that a lot of US companies left South Korea. They were trying to save, you know, be out of the conflict zone. So that's another thing. When you always, as I think Bill also mentioned at the beginning, when there is a war and there is an enemy out there that is threatening you, it's much easier to control the people and direct people's, you know, problems projected onto something else out there. They are having much more problems than us. You cannot complain about this type of thing is happening. That had happened in South Korea, and I'm sure to a lot of degrees it may be happening in North Korea. So when there's a peacetime, we are giving it the more power to the people to be able to resolve it by themselves. And that's all North Koreans are asking, is leave us alone. And we'll handle our problems. You know, so when I went to North Korea, it was 2002. And they were just coming out of the famine, quote-unquote famine, right? Because of all this lack of food. And no one talked about, whenever we asked questions about famine or like, the meal, no one talked about it. They said, oh, it's a thing of a past. We are fine, we are okay. By 2008, people talked about the famine. Because I think by then they felt like they are doing much better. They are not dying anymore. So they talked about the food issues. You know, back then we really didn't have much to eat. You know, we had to go and cut so much trees, and then with the trees, the bark of the tree, how to make the porridge. Like there was this instructions come out from the top to the bottom. And people only ate like 1 meal a day and then tried to just leave. They are still poor. Another example is one of my group went to Baekdusan Hotel, and there was like a 2-star hotel, and then they said that they don't have a room. And then I was like, but there's no guests in this hotel. How come there's no room? And so then they were like, how many rooms do you need? You need 6 rooms. We only have 5. So I said, this big hotel, it was a really big hotel. Why? Because they didn't have toilet seats. The blockade, I don't know why the toilet seats are luxurious goods, but it was blockaded. So then, this hotel did not have a toilet seats. So then they didn't want to show it to the foreigners, the toilets that without the toilet cover. So they were saying like the room's not available. So we had to talk a long time that the people who are in the tour guide will be using it. Don't worry about it. We're not gonna say anything. So we used it. So when one of our member was a little bit big, and she sat on it, and then it broke. The devastation the management had, and they were like, it's not supplied anymore, So then that's when we finally felt. Oh. But then we were like, but didn't they say about something about the military related, the security related? It's not something of a people's daily goods. And then they said it's categorized as a luxurious goods. And that only the Kim family or the yacht, they talk about the yacht, and they never talked about the toilet seats. So they are in every day they are being fed, and it's not it's a poor country. It is not rich country, but people live in the poor countries happily too. It's just the daily ways. We went to we went to Sariwon, one of closer. It's not to the city. It's a town. It's a rural area. We went to town, and then we were just trying to get together with the farmers. And then one of the older lady was talking to me like, I don't know what the world is coming to. Like nowadays, on the streets, the boys and girls, they're holding hands and walking together. And I was like, holding hands is a very natural way of, getting together, no? They're like, when I was young, that was not even possible. So I said, when was that, hundreds of years ago? I mean, people are really funny. They really enjoy singing and dancing. I'm not sure if you saw the opening ceremony and the special concert that North Koreans had in South Korea, in Seoul. They are really wearing the fancy day dance. In a factory, everyone is obligated, quote unquote, obligated to do this post-lunch exercise. And there was what my delegation called it as a sexy dance. Because it was a kind of move, for 20 minutes, they all do the exercise and then they go in. There is definitely a collective culture. There may be, I'm not sure, I don't live there. So there are things that I observe and there are things that, I cannot even see. But there's a lot of laughter, people joke around. They work really hard. There are not much of gas, so there is a bus, but people are walking. There's a tractor, but it's not moving. They use the cows to till the land, but they make it do. There are a lot of inventions that they made. They even make a fabric out of coal, because there's no way that they can import the cottons anymore. So then they had to make a do, and they are trying to be with Juche, the self-reliance. If the blockade is not going away, then they have to make ways to be able to live and provide for people. So a lot of emphasis on the science, a lot of emphasis on trying to make ends. The people, not only I never met Kim Jong-un personally. I don't think I will ever, but I'm sure there are corruptions within officers. But the first thing they always talk about is the people, the masses. How do we serve the masses? It's an interesting combination of various aspects. But I want to say that if we leave them alone, if all the superpowers around, the Russians, Chinese, Japan, US, everyone leave them alone, they will find their ways to develop their own and then change their own country for the better. And they are very proud and confident people, One of the songs that they in South Korea they sing is it's a Gwangju song, and they said it that without love, without honor, people always promise that we will be pursuing one goal. For that one goal, we'll strive, and that's for the betterment of our lives. And for South Koreans, it was a song for the democracy. So for the democracy that you die, and if I die, you place you keep my position alive. Even if I die, I'll follow you in my spirit. And this type of the pursuance of democracy and freedom and just life. Are we alive? How do we know we are alive? Because we strive for something, we work for something. And that's, the goal of North Korea is just to survive. Survive and make it better.
Well, I think, from my perspective, certainly Kim Jong-un's a dictator. He has serious human rights issues. But the idea that he's crazy, I think, is a myth. He knows what he wants. He's got a plan to maintain control of the country, and therefore he's not going to risk his position by lashing out, attacking the United States, for example. So I think the U.S. negotiated with Stalin. Stalin was not a nice person. So it's, I think there's kind of two issues. One is, she talked about the resilience of the people in North Korea. And as long as he's under military threat and he's under economic embargo, it's actually easier for him to hold power because he can point to the foreign enemy, and it's harder for people to push back against what he's doing in the country. So, I think the idea that he's unpredictable and crazy clouds the issue. The fact that he's a dictator, he's got human rights abuses, is not a reason to start World War III. So it's, that's kind of the difference. I think in some of the popular understanding or some of the slant to the information we get, it's somehow those are confused. He's this crazy guy, he's like the equivalent of a suicide bomber, he doesn't care about himself. he's going to attack us just to show he can do it. I don't think that's the case. And that's sort of what William Perry was saying. The guy's not suicidal. You can make a deal with him if you agree that you're not going to basically threaten to kill him. And very few people would make a deal under those circumstances. So it doesn't change the fact that he's got serious problems. He's a dictator. He's a problem for the people of North Korea. But as was pointed out, if there wasn't so much interference within the country, I think North and South could work out an arrangement that would eventually lead towards peace.
That seems like the best place to stop. So thank you both very much for coming. I think before you get up, Helen, did you want to announce about your appointment tomorrow? This is Helen Bichelle, who's also a BFP member.
Hi. I'm a...
Thanks.
Hi, I'm here as a member of the International Trade Education Squad of the Park Slope Food Co-op. We have been working cooperatively with the Brooklyn for Peace, Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture, and the Park Slope United Methodist Church in order to be doing a series of community dialogues on NAFTA. And tomorrow morning, we have an appointment with Senator Gillibrand's office to discuss NAFTA issues. And I'm asking if there is anyone here who has time available tomorrow morning, 10:30 to 11:30, to join our delegation. Thank you.
So if that applies to you, please speak to either me or Helen, and we'll give you the exact information. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you on March 19th, if not before.